Troy suddenly says she is sensing a powerful mind. This thing appears outside the ship. Q appears on the bridge wearing, what would that be? Maybe like 14th century ship attire, or maybe give or take 100 or 200 years. I don't know. But anyway, he comes on board saying, "Thou art notified that thy kind has infiltrated the galaxy too far already. Thou art directed to return to thine own solar system immediately." Picard, he's like, "That's quite a directive. Would you mind identifying what you are?" "We call ourselves the Q, or thou mayest call me that. It's all much the same thing. I present myself to thee as a fellow ship captain, that thou mayest better understand me. Go back whence thou camest." And that's when this officer pulls out his Type 1 phaser. Q says, "Stay where thou art," and then freezes him with this scary magical freeze mist. So we could say, I suppose, in this episode at least, when Q is introduced, Q basically shows up as a story element. He shows up as a cartoony, farcical, or satirical god, capital G, with his main role in the episode being, I think, to engage us in a discussion on the nature of humanity. The question he's there to ask is humanity a failure or a success? Is humanity primarily good or primarily evil, primarily bad? And Q's thesis in his first appearing here is, all y'all go home because you don't deserve to be out here. Go back where you came from before you make a mess of everything and you hurt more people, because that's what humans do. And interestingly as well, you may notice a couple of hints that Q is intended as a satirical or farcical version of not just God or a god, but probably specifically what would be in view would be the God of Christianity, at least in a distant and lighthearted manner, because everything starts off with this Elizabethan language, thee, thou, and thy, etc., as well as Elizabethan dress. He says he's wearing ship captain attire, maybe from what, the 14th, 15th, 16th century? Hard to tell. But using this Elizabethan language, it's kind of like how in Where No Man Has Gone Before, Gary Mitchell, as he became this god type being, he began to speak in archaic language at exactly the same time, or roughly the same time, when the episode started to invoke the Garden of Eden imagery and all this kind of stuff of Mitchell, basically Mitchell comparing himself to the God of Christianity. Well, that came with this kind of archaic language he was using. And I think that's because archaic English, and specifically the King James Bible with the archaic language in it, until recently had a very strong association with kind of traditional old-fashioned Christianity, even though I'd say probably in the last 20 years or so, that association has maybe been fading a little bit. But anyway, it seems like Q comes on board, starting right off the bat with that language, kind of leaning into that association. Now, of course, it's worth remembering as well, using a god of some kind as a storytelling device is very much a well-worn trope in Star Trek, which was TOS up to this point primarily. Very much a well-worn trope in such a way that we may suspect the initial appearance of Q is probably going to be a little less about Q and what Q is, because that's just a well-worn trope, and more about using him as a storytelling device to get him to say certain things. And in this case, what he's talking about, getting us to think about, asking questions about, is humanity. We're talking about the history of humanity, both our real world history of humanity, as well as this new post-history that Gene Roddenberry is bringing into existence when he writes this episode, with all the stuff leading up to the birth of the Federation, etc. So not about Q primarily, but more so about us and our future. And then Q is just a fun, fanciful voice he used to say all that stuff and to ask those questions. And I think that particular way of thinking about it, I think it gets even clearer when you realize that this whole Q part of the story was made up to expand an already finished Farpoint story. So they had the story written, but it was a 1 hour story, and it was just the Farpoint story without Q in it. But then the network demanded a longer story. We need to fill a 2 hour slot, and Roddenberry resisted that, but then finally, okay, well, I guess I got to do something. He ended up coming up with this Q story. So if you realize that kind of, I think, reinforces what I suggested. But then also when you realize that Q's personality, it looks like it was basically lifted straight from Trelane, the Trelane character from the original series of Star Trek, in the sense that you could say that Q basically is Trelane, just with a whole lot more power. And in terms of the role he plays in the plot, he kind of needs to have all that extra power, more power than Trelane, in order for this story to work, because Q has got to be able to be making comments and having opinions on the whole history of humanity. I mean, Trelane, if I remember right, he knew a lot. He could see a lot. He was watching for a lot of history. But Q has like complete knowledge. And then Q has also got to be able to appear on the Enterprise both before they go off to their Farpoint mission and also at any other point. It's like Q could show up at any point He's got to have that kind of being not limited by space at all. And then Q's also got to have, for the story to work, he's got to have this kind of bird's eye perspective, or this God's eye perspective, if you will, on everything. So for all that to be able to happen, then this modified Trelane here is going to have to be a kind of a more of an absolute entity. And once you say that, then you're kind of leaning a little closer to a capital G kind of God. And so the end result is that whereas Trelane came out as kind of a pretentious god, small g, kind of pretending to be bigger than he was, Q kind of ends up coming out to be more like, we could say, a cartoon absurdist version of God, capital G, who actually is more or less what he claims to be. And then it only follows logically that Roddenberry would begin to model this new, bigger, more absolute version of Trelane, that he would start to model that after the version of the Christian God with which he's most familiar, and whom he so greatly dislikes, of course. So it seems to me that when Roddenberry finally came up with this new story that he would add to the Farpoint story to make it into a 2-hour story, it seems to me that Roddenberry's basic idea would have probably been something like, on the way to Farpoint, on the way to this story, this cartoon version of God shows up, capital G, but he's an absolute ass. He shows up on the bridge of the Enterprise to taunt the Enterprise about the checkered history of humanity, which gives us an opportunity to hear Picard telling us how far humanity has come between our day and this 24th century time of them. But Picard can't just give us that new Starfleet history and then we call it good. That wouldn't give us much of a story. No, instead, since this god is such a prick, Picard is going to have to prove it, while Q continues to goad him with relentless insinuations about how even Picard himself is corrupt and corrosive like the worst of his ancestors. Thou art notified that thy kind has progressed too far already. Thou art notified that thy kind must subscribe or experience the vengeance of jellyfish squid creatures from the 9th dimension. Subscribe! Subscribe! But of course, the Q concept became more nuanced and interesting the more we saw him over the series. But anyway, back to the episode here. Now, Picard, he's angry, of course, and he holds up the phaser for Q to say, like, this was set on stun. Then Q shoots back, knowing humans as thou dost, Captain, wouldst thou be captured helpless by them? And that's the first foreshadowing that we get of the kind of grim narrative that Q is going to be trying to paint about humans just moments later. Kind of a mirror of the kind of line that you would get in later Star Trek when people say, for example, O'Brien might say, you really don't want to get captured by Cardassians. You know what they do to their prisoners? That kind of thing. Or like, do you really want to get captured by Klingons? Because for Q here, what he's saying is that's humanity. Q is suggesting the kinds of horrifying things that Cardassians or such like might do to their prisoners. He's saying, well, that's humans did all that. He's saying, I would rather die than get captured by humans, to paraphrase what O'Brien might say about the Cardassians. So while Picard recoils at that accusation, Q finishes, he says, go back, or thou shalt most certainly die. In kind of a connotative partial quote of God from the fall of man narrative in the Bible in Genesis 3. So basically that's the part of the Bible where humanity falls or becomes sinful when sin comes into existence, which incidentally is kind of a fitting quote for Q here, because Q's whole narrative that he's going to be arguing for is a narrative about how sinful humanity is. So it's kind of fitting that the writer to put into his mouth a kind of partial quote from God in the Bible at the part of the Bible where man falls and becomes corrupt. Anyway, so he says that, and that's when we fade out for the commercial break. And then we come back in hearing Captain's Log, supplementary. And it actually says supplementary. Normally in Star Trek, it's supplemental, but in this bit here, he actually says supplementary. Anyway, Captain's Log, supplementary. The frozen form of Lieutenant Torres has been rushed to sickbay. The question now is the incredible power of the Q being. Do we dare oppose it? Q notes how fast the centuries go and suggests Picard might better understand this. And in a flash of light, he changes himself into a Marine Corps uniform and makes some comment about doing away with the commies. And Picard responds in this mystified tone. He says, what? That nonsense is centuries behind us. And Q says, but you can't deny that you're still a dangerous, savage child race. Picard is indignant. He says, most certainly I deny it. I agree we still were when humans wore costumes like that 400 years ago, which time you slaughtered millions in silly arguments about how to divide the resources of your little world. He takes a step closer. And 400 years before that, you were murdering each other in quarrels over tribal god images. Since then, there are no indications that humans will ever change. Picard says, but even when we wore costumes like that, we had already started to make rapid progress. Oh, yeah? You want to review your rapid progress? And then Q transforms himself into this